Welcome, everybody, to the fourth episode of American Spirits. I'm joined once again by Ryan Turnipseed and Auberon Quinn, and today we will be discussing the book Creating the Commonwealth, The Economic Culture of Puritan New England by Stephen Innes. So, welcome, gentlemen. Ryan, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Feeling nice and cool now that it's overcast. So that's awesome.
Good.
Uh, Mr. Quinn, how are you?
I am locked in and ready to improve the time for the next 2 hours.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, so that's really what this book is about. Creating a Commonwealth focuses obviously on the Puritans. We've covered the Puritans to a great extent when we talked about the book Albion's Seed. And this book is a historical discussion of the economic systems of Puritan New England, but not exclusively. These are tied into other social systems that the Puritans developed as well. And I think after reading this book, I can say that, and I don't think this would be a controversial take, but it's quite clear that the American Revolution could not have succeeded were it not for what we call the Protestant work ethic. It's really referring to the particular industrious and complex economic organization of the Puritans. Uh, if you watch films about the Puritans or early America in general, or if you're familiar with that famous play by what's it called, The Crucible. Uh, the Puritans are sort of regarded in media as this backward, uh, you know, forest-dwelling people who live in these small villages, and they have these religiously extreme points of view, and they're sort of entirely fixated on that. But the reality is New England, even in the 17th century, set up an advanced economic and town structure that really very quickly began to rival anything in the old world. So, either of you gentlemen wish to take it from there?
Yeah, it's important to point out that your statement that the American Revolution could never have succeeded without the Commonwealth created by the Puritans is both true in physical terms, in terms of the sheer industrial might and demographic weight that New England would take on, but also in more abstract philosophical terms, in terms of the traditions of independence and self-governance, which we will examine the emergence of as we get through the book here.
Right. It's important on those grounds, and then there's also then relating to America today. There's a lot of things that this book covers that I think have been unfairly maligned by more recent commentary. So we've already mentioned things like the Protestant work ethic. That's something that has a rather negative connotation if you look at some of the other people in our sphere. Puritans as well, though hopefully we've dispelled some of those negative connotations already. Um, but then there's going to be a few other things because the Puritans created a very interesting system where they tried to combine a fairly free market economy with a social system that ensured that the public welfare was looked after, which is it's in a very American system. Something that has also been subject to, I think, undue revision recently, but it was not perfect.
Yeah, if the producer would like to pull up slide shot number one, this segues nicely. Two principal tensions kind of stuck out to me in this book. The first one is between the fact that the Puritan metaphysical worldview, just by its nature, tended to generate immense material abundance. And this, in turn, as we will see, generated waves of condemnation of materialism that nonetheless we would see slide into a secularization and a materialization of the New England worldview over time. The other great tension that I found very interesting was there at the very start between the two kind of principal gentlemen in the founding of the New England colonies, these being John Smith, who people tend to associate with Virginia. This is the Disney character John Smith from Pocahontas, and John Winthrop, the first governor in there. And these two men had, in some ways similar, but in other ways quite different visions for what kind of society New England can be. And as we go through the book, we'll explore, what parts of these two men's visions came to reality, which ones did not, and how that might have resolved itself in a better way.
Right.
Yes. So, yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say something that we'll see when discussing those systems, a very long-running theme so far throughout American spirits, and probably one that will not go away for a long time, is this idea that as you lose the beliefs of the people that made these systems, they tend to degenerate and not just stop working, but start actively harming people. So that's something else to look out for, something that's in the cycle of wealth and condemnations of wealth.
Indeed, but let us begin at the beginning. This is the godly, metaphysically sound Puritan worldview, that by conceiving of the godly as a mutual aid society, when could those be useful? Massachusetts Puritans fostered what the theorists call social capital, networks, norms, and trust that enhance and amplify the benefits of investment in physical and human capital.
Yes, so this book discusses this term, actually, human capital and social capital built out of the networks these people form, which obviously, if it wasn't plainly obvious by your light sarcasm there, that's more or less what we're doing, more rather than less. So there's capitalism is referenced in this book, and the concept of capital. One of the things the book does is determine really how capitalistic the Puritan colony was. And it would be wrong to say that the Puritans were capitalist in the sense that we would understand it. And Ryan used the term free market earlier, and that is the direction that the colony by and large devolved. I use that word intentionally in terms of devolving control from central to local apparatuses. But it was never the anarchic system of completely ruleless, stateless, capitalist process ongoing. There were the central, the general court, I believe, is what their central government apparatus was called.
Yep.
Very deliberately set very high level policies, particularly in terms of which things the colony focused on developing. And these things were the more advanced things like ironworks, sawmills, shipbuildings, that sort of thing. So you had very broad central directives on how the colony and the towns needed to orient themselves towards in terms of what they were producing. Like the ironworks in particular were really important in maintaining the middle class that the Puritan colony was based on.
And maybe it would be helpful to backtrack a second, set up the geography that we're talking about.
Yeah.
The New England area had very poor rocky soil. It had a lot of rivers. It had a lot of forests. And this contrasts it to richer, more prosperous, as we'll see, more natural wealth possessing areas such as Virginia. And the Puritans were aware of this fact and viewed it as a positive recommendation of New England. If we want to bring up screenshot number 2, it says that if men desire to have a people degenerate speedily, and to corrupt their minds and bodies too, and besides to toll in themselves and spoilers from abroad, let them seek a rich soil that brings in much with little labor. So we see at the outset here, they very consciously selected the geography that they did for, in their view, its morally improving qualities. This is also something that John Smith would remark upon. After he left the Virginia colony and sailed up the coast through New England, he immediately grasped the same idea, even though he himself was not a Puritan, that the soil, and particularly the abundance of rivers, would be very conducive to a diversified economy of industry and subsistence agriculture, as opposed to a cash crop economy such as they attempted to build in Virginia.
Right, and
Yes,
this
and the New England geography was very. There's a quote in here somewhere. I can't. I don't have the page reference, but the Puritans who originally settled the space identified that this part of the country was ripe to be turned into something great by mixing their labor with their own particular culture with the land. It's not a place where one would survive easily, but it was a place where one could thrive with the appropriate effort. Ryan.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this was also somewhat true of the other side, picking the land to correspond with their work ethic, if you will. Specifically because the Puritans, and I'm sure we'll get to this in greater depth in a moment, the Puritans liked work. It was central to their theology. It was a core part of their belief system, as opposed to the more medieval cultures which would settle in the south of the United States, which we talked about in Albion Seed a lot. They looked a lot more high medieval, where work was not something to be desired necessarily. They did not come from a strain of theology that viewed work as a good thing. Rather, it was leisure that was good and aristocratic. So this is a conscious on both sides. And this is this also sort of, you can probably still see this today, actually, and I think the author remarks on this, that even throughout American history, you could see the divide north and south on the subject. So,
Indeed, and on that point, if we want to bring up screenshot number 3, Tocqueville talked about this himself, viewing the South and North as being opposite in this very way, where the spirit of freedom and the spirit of religion allowed one to work without shame in the North. In the South, as we saw with Albion Seed, independence, and by independence they meant independent wealth, was the thing to be strived for, or not even strived for, the thing to be granted by fortune, and to base one's pride thereon. Whereas in the North, this work ethic was much more than, it must be emphasized, it's much more than a material ethic. The Puritans did view work as worship, and the sacralization of the workplace kind of went in hand with the, I want to say desacralization, but demystification of the church. The Puritan churches were very plain. There were no communion rails. There wasn't a lot of ritual. And instead, your working life was the ritual. Your daily pursuits were viewed as worship by the Puritans.
right. And
Yeah, I believe Albion Seed has a section that mentioned this, where it's not simply the act of work that puts you toward the path of salvation, but the inner perspective you have. So two people could be doing the same work, but the one who is doing it as a ritual of worship versus the one who's doing it for profit.
Yes, thank you. That brings up the important distinction. The Puritans did not believe in salvation through work, obviously, but rather that work was a reflection of an inward state.
Ryan, what were you going to add?
Oh, I was going to say that this ties into a wider Protestant theology, where each person has a specific form of work, multiple kinds actually, that they are called to, or that's their vocation. This is something that's quite central to, I think, the majority of Protestant theology, especially at this time period. But
and if we go to,
I was going to say something that was pretty important, though. This gets called the Protestant work ethic, mainly coined by Weber, who didn't actually really view it as a Protestant work ethic. If you read him, he has this strange sort of philo-Semitic reading of the Protestant work ethic. But the Protestants were not the only groups that had this theology. I believe Ennis makes a good point that the Benedictines also had this, at least in some capacity.
Ora et lavora. That
right.
is Latin for work and prayer, which was the Benedictine motto.
Right. So this is any traditionalists in our spheres that discount the Protestant work ethic, if they're being honest about what it was. I think this overlap between the Puritans and the Benedictines, at least on this major emphasis on work and one's calling to work and the worshipful aspect of work, perhaps should inspire just a little bit of caution.
Now,
Yeah,
this,
the phrase Protestant work ethic is a bit of a misnomer, because that is the phrase people use to refer to this behavior from the Puritans. But it's really important to emphasize that the Protestant work ethic isn't like just working hard or something. It's working to work as an act of worship, essentially. The purpose of the work is to improve the time to glorify God. You're not just working really hard for profit or for whatever reason. You're specifically working for a religious end.
and it's also not characteristic of Protestantism generally, but rather of specific strains of Protestantism. And in fact, what did not happen in England, but did happen what did not happen in New England, but did happen in England, was a reaction against this very thing. If we want to pull up screenshot number 4. Here we see the vehemence of the reaction against the Puritans, and just for historical context here, after the English Civil War and the Protectorate, Charles II, the son of the executed Charles I, returned to England and reassumed reign of the land, and very shortly started quite a counter-revolution against the Puritans. And so that's the context for this next quote. The vehemence of the reaction against the Puritans and all things Puritan during the reign of Charles II eventually canalized the Protestant ethic into the more private realm of dissent, where the Quakers and the Presbyterians, who we had cause to talk about in the last couple of weeks, were its principal representatives. Within the Church of England, Puritans were also eventually defeated by the Arminian attempt to restore the mystery and majesty of the Henrician Church. Resacralizing the church to a considerable degree had the effect of desacralizing the workplace. The moment that railings went up around the communion tables in English churches, the Protestant ethic was undermined, for in the making altars and prayers especially holy, therefore worthy of special care, the Laudians made plows and shop counters less holy, less significant as means of glorifying God and working out salvation.
Yeah, this is so if you look at various strains of theology, this is something that gets noted. I believe even Albion Seed noted this trend, that the more liturgical or the more high church a strain of theology is, and this is just a general social trend, there's nothing inherently wrong with one way or the other here, at least by this reading. The more liturgical or high church a denomination is, the more it struggles with two things. One of which would be just general productivity, the focus on the liturgics, and the more hierarchical nature of the church just has a social tendency to de-emphasize production. This is a historical thing. If you asked me why that is, I don't think I or many other people could give a 100% satisfactory answer. But then the second one, as we saw in Albion Seeds, there's a tendency in the more liturgical societies to de-emphasize the effects of social degeneration. That was a main sticking point that I think most of us had when we were covering the American South. So this should fall right into line if anyone tuned into episodes 1 and 2 with the trends we were seeing in American society.
Indeed, and we'll see a particularly vehement reaction to degenerative tendencies in the Puritan clergy as we get forward. But just touching on this question of why an increase of liturgy tends to a decrease in sacralization of everyday life, if we go to screenshot number 5, we at least have a data point. The old calendar was purged of its red letter, holy days, and the 220 potential workdays available in early modern Europe were increased to over 300 in Massachusetts. So there at least we have a raw mathematical and physical explanation for at least part of this trend.
Yeah, I also wanted to comment on these concepts of honest gain versus present profit. There's a couple of points where this is brought up in the book. Specifically, there's a court case that's brought up regarding the sale of nails I believe his name was Quinn, who was involved in this trial that was pretty significant in determining the prices that merchants were allowed to set for their wares. So the Puritans were very open to the concept of honest gain. That basically you're allowed to sell your goods at the market price, what they're worth. But what you weren't allowed to do is to seek excessive profit by marking up your product more than the quote unquote true value of the thing. However one might measure that, they had their own, basically whatever the generally agreed upon price is. Obviously, these are kind of ethereal concepts that probably Ryan would have some disagreement with. But the point is that the Puritans were not against making a profit, but they were against excessive profit. So
Indeed.
basically, so long as your profits were not detrimentally taking wealth and accumulating it in oneself. I think, earlier you mentioned the Virginian concept of freedom was establishing independent wealth. That basically wasn't a thing in New England. They were very intent on maintaining a middle class where everyone was the middle class. There would be no centralization of wealth in particular figures. And whenever that started to happen, that's when the general court would take a look at what was going on and try and see if there was some sort of law breaking or regulations that needed to be put in place to stop a person from gathering independent wealth, because the point wasn't to be independent. Every merchant was interested in the public welfare primarily in terms of how they ran their business, and they would naturally garner a profit from that. But the public welfare had to primarily be the purpose of the business, whether or not you were selling nails or cattle or some other service.
Yeah, private gain was very much intended to be set to public ends in the New England conception.
And then, so part of that idea as well, and we kind of saw this earlier, this worry that if you had rich lands, you would be importing thieves and ne'er-do-wells and all these other socially undesirable types to work them just for the pure pursuit of profit. You can see this still play out in the modern day. I believe if I remember correctly, there was the video that went viral some time ago from Orania, the Boers in South Africa, pointing out that this was the case, that there are many prosperous societies that undermined their core group. And since most societies that are pioneered tend to come from like middle class types, that's the middle class hollowing themselves out, the Iranians would not import outside labor. It was they recognized that it was an economic downside, but it was a social upside. So this is you can see this playing out with the Puritans here as well. This idea that the economic concern, according to their moral system, is under or bound by the social concern. It's still allowed. It's just conformed to it.
Indeed, and it's important to point out that while this vision of a society of the middle class was a flattened social hierarchy, it was not a flat social hierarchy. In Massachusetts, two ranks were recognized, that of gentlemen and that of freeholders. So you'll find there's no top rank of aristocrat. There's the second to top rank of gentleman. There's the third to top rank of freeholder, and then there's no bottom rank of peasant or day laborer. So they're not absolute equalitarians, but they wanted a flatter social rank rather than complete equality amongst the members of the church.
It's the middle, if you will.
Yeah,
of
literally it's the two middle classes, the upper middle and the lower middle, with the
right.
bottom class and the top class excluded.
Right.
And then just on this point of profit being licit but excessive profit not, I will read you a quote from Cotton Mather. No matter how vigorous a pretender of religion a man might be, Mather averred, if he be not a fair dealer in the marketplace, that man's religion is in vain. So they had this strong concept of fair dealing rather than unlimited profit seeking. Line can go up, but only so much.
Well, and even then, it's not specifically So this is what struck me, because I always thought that the Puritans took like a middle route in terms of like economic intervention, just from an economic analysis, but that's not really the case.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the Puritans do not care about the line, provided the moral system is upheld. Line going up is fine. It's just only later when they start seeing connections between perhaps outsiders trying to profit from them, and then also their own citizens becoming amoral with the increase in wealth. Only after that point do they really start caring about the line going up only so much. Before, at the start of the colony, perhaps short-sightedly, but otherwise interesting to me, is that the line doing things did not really matter. It was purely just the social good that was being pursued, which
Indeed, and since we're there touching on the amoralization that would slowly occur, can we pull up screenshot 11, please? While the ministers were excoriating the behavior of merchants, laborers, and frontiersmen, they never for a moment condemned merchandising, laboring, or the expansion of the frontier. They berated the consequences of progress, but never progress.
So I remember reading this quote, and I thought that it was a strange conundrum. But I actually don't think that this is the worst thing. Perhaps on a sort of meta level, what would we do? Just because it's very difficult to establish a direct causal connection between. He refers to it here as progress, economic development, or whatever else, the material thing, and people becoming amoral necessarily. Even Scripture talks about this. It's a trend, but I'm struggling to remember right now if it ever says this specifically causes this and is the main cause, as if poverty is the cure to sin.
That's it. I don't think we're asserting that it's causative, rather that it's a generative almost. The worldview that the Puritans had generated great material abundance. And as Jesus said, it is harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle. That is just going to result in spiritual sickness for a great many people who aren't spiritually prepared to handle that. So I don't know if it's you say it's not the worst, but I don't think it's a matter of calling it better or worse. I think it's just a matter of understanding in the American context what ills we are prone to and design our corrective measures there around.
Well, that was specifically what I was trying to get towards, was that this is more a call that you just have to orient your society around it, especially if you take the views that reach you to this position. That was the focus, I think, should not necessarily be on the more traditionalist talking point that wealth, prosperity, and whatever else causes bad things, but rather it should we really need to focus on what do we do in the meantime, or what do we do if we had power.
We are presented with the eye of a needle, and we must determine how to thread it, essentially, is the task before us.
So in terms of threading that needle and not degenerating, one of the things that Ryan mentioned earlier that the Puritans were extremely averse to doing is importing labor and the disastrous consequences that could have. We might discuss this more in detail later, but I'm in this particular case referring to the Hammersmith ironworks, the first ironworks set up in the New World, and how that ironworks, which eventually failed, did rely heavily on imported laborers, which was somewhat necessary because of the particular hard labor that it was to work in an ironworks in that era, during that period. And these were, you could imagine that even if the people were not particularly rough to begin with, working in such a place would turn one into a bit of a ruffian, and the colony had issues with drinking and violence and that sort of thing in regard to these laborers. And of course, it's a very easy analogy to make today to discuss or to refer back to the detrimental effects that the Puritans experienced by importing foreign labor, even labor from Englishmen, but still foreign to their particular culture, and the problems we see with doing that exact same thing today. Somehow it seems like this never really works out.
Well, I mean, just look at New England today. It is not a predominantly congregationalist population anymore. So,
It's not
Yes, they
predominantly
have in
English.
fact. No, it does not. They have suffered the degeneration that was foreseen and warned about. So
Ryan, a bit ago you mentioned the New England. You were previously perceiving them as sort of a middle way between capitalism and state intervention, but state intervention was not absent. If we want to pull up screenshot number 16, we can see that the general court would absolutely intervene in the market when it felt it necessary. Thus, in 1641, they established a 8% limit on the price of commercial credit, so capping interest rates. And then if we look at screenshot number 17, kind of post hoc looking back, you'll see that public authority in the colonial period enjoyed vastly greater formal power over production and exchange than it would possess after the ratification of the Constitution. So they weren't afraid to intervene in the marketplace according to their lights.
yes.
Right. Sorry,
And there were several instances where, for example, they granted monopolies. One of them I can recall was a fishing monopoly in was it Lake Superior? There was a company who was going to fish in a large lake in the northeast of the country, and basically the company demanded that they be given like a 1-year monopoly or something like that because of the danger in venturing out into the frontier. There were a few other cases where there were temporary monopolies, often as a sort of bonus for starting up, right? So the colony had certain needs, be it a sawmill and ironworks, the things needed to develop the sort of most advanced technology of the time. The state would grant monopoly rights for a time to the first investor because the risk was simply too high if there wasn't a state backing it up, basically. Ryan.
I was just going to say this is one of the interesting cases where the Constitution forced a group of people to be less interventionist than they were beforehand. This is something that we talked about a lot when we went through Albion Seed was the Puritan ideal of self-sufficiency and community determination. And then, interestingly, when you get to the ratification of the Constitution, there's usually people see a lot of New England influence on the Constitution. It is the Constitution and then the various applications of it that caused the society to stop existing. And in fact, it's after, say, immigration policy is nationalized that New England irreversibly demographically shifts away from these people. So when I'm talking about the capitalist central plan interventionist thing, what I was trying to refer to is that I always thought the Puritans had this idea of interventionism as like an economic principle, but rather it seems to just be a moral one. With the economic effect being secondary.
Yeah, very much so. Their justification for their interventions is always grounded in morality, not because that is the optimal way to increase production, according to their theories. And this would evolve over time because, of course, while the Puritans are in Massachusetts, things continue to happen in Europe. If we could pull up screenshot 21, please. So the Puritans get over to Massachusetts in the 1630s, 1640s, and while they're in Massachusetts, the Enlightenment starts gaining traction in Europe. And as the Enlightenment proceeded, we see that sanctioned gain also achieved normative status. The intellectual justification for the pursuit of gain for the purpose of bettering oneself and the community was in part provided by the revolution in rationalism and moral political philosophy carried out in the 16th and 17th centuries. The rationalist revolution, which was largely the work of Machiavelli, Spinoza, Erasmus, Bacon, and eventually Hobbes, and even Locke, helped redefine unlimited acquisition from a sin to a public-spirited excellence.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we aren't trying to explode your American history education or whatever, but there is this strange meme that I don't think people really ever refute, that the American Revolution took root because of this strange idea coming from Adam Smith, which coincidentally was published like the year of the Revolution. Somehow that caused the revolution or whatever. But dates aside, this is not the same economic system. This Smithian system, this idea of seeking profit does create the social welfare, is not what the Puritans believe, and they thought that they could be intertwined in a certain way, but one did not cause the other.
No, indeed, the Puritan experiment, of course, began before the Enlightenment really got going, although obviously Machiavelli and Spinoza and Erasmus had written before the Puritans left for America, but it hadn't really penetrated to East Anglia that much, I don't think. But as time goes by and the Enlightenment gains momentum in Europe, you do begin to start to see the changes in the Puritan worldview and the American worldview generally that only kind of had half percolated by the time of the Revolution. So it's not to say that the Revolution was unrelated to the Enlightenment, but it's not Enlightenment, therefore revolution. Certainly not.
Yeah, and that's I'm sure we might talk about this later, but one of the actual causes, I would say, of the Revolution was a sort of revival that happened in New England. If you take an advanced American history course, this is the old light, new light controversy, where you had some firebrands, Puritan revivalists, trying to reinvigorate this older Puritan society. This Enlightenment thought eventually penetrating New England, causing them to accept this unlimited acquisition of property idea.
Mm-hmm.
This is what causes that controversy. This is what causes the churches to lose influence, sort of become stale, old, and all the other stuff that usually goes along with that narrative.
Cyclically, as it turns out, if you look at a broad enough stretch of time. But if we go to screenshot 22, we see again this idea that not for the last time, Protestant religion and secularizing philosophy worked through opposite means to accomplish similar ends. Acquisitiveness, previously regarded as a socially destructive vice, was now openly defended by Edward Misselton and Thomas Munn during the economic policy debates of the 1620s. So as the Protestant work ethic kind of rises to consciousness, at the same time, acquisitiveness within the context of improving the public good takes on a virtuous aspect.
Right, and something else that might be worth mentioning here as well is that this is you might be thinking that the economic thought that's developing here is libertarian, free market, whatever else, the usual stuff that gets blamed for the current economic environment. But in reality, the people that were defending this were largely mercantilist, which is also why New England society looked very mercantilist, especially going into the 19th century. This idea of mercantilism, this sort of forced industrialization of specific regions and extractive industries and others. This is the sort of industry that took off as a result of these thoughts, as opposed to like the smallhold farmers, which was the earlier ideal.
Yeah, this mercantilist point can't be overemphasized enough. The idea of the mixed economy of New England was entirely to generate this export-led economy where the natural wealth of the land would be combined with the artificial wealth of the laborers to create products for export. And that was the basis of their economic theory, was they would generate goods, export them, and thereby profit. And this mercantilist tendency was noticed very early on by future rivals. So if we can pull up screenshot number 7. So the Earl of Sandwich noticed very early on that New England's mercantilist economy was inevitably going to create a rival to England. And he says in 1671, the New Englanders already were, he declared, a numerous and thriving people, and in 20 years are more likely, if civil wars or other accidents prevent them not, to be mighty, rich, and not at all careful to preserve their dependence upon old England. Accordingly, the Earl concluded, prophetically, that a coercive imperial policy would simply drive the colonists to independence. The way of roughness and peremptory orders, with force to back them, would be utterly inadvisable, for they already are too strong to be compelled. So you can see this mercantilist economic model, with scarcely not even 50 years from the founding of the colony, had already risen up what far-sighted individuals could see would be a rival to Europe.
Right, and the other thing to keep in mind as well is that if you're going to sort of cause an early industrialization through mercantilism, you're going to have some sort of laboring class, which, as we mentioned at the beginning, this was absent at the start of the colony, and especially in the more theologically minded elements of the colony under, say, Winthrop. This was not really to be the case. There's not supposed to be this underclass who only exists for economic gain, in complete defiance of the Puritans' theological beliefs. But that's what this policy creates. And then that's also why, if you go into 19th century American writings about New England, they do mention underclasses. It's more equal in a certain sense than other parts of the country, where landowners, like the underclass in New England, might have some land. But the fact there was an underclass below the middle class and the other people that had their own workshops and whatnot else was a degeneration from the start.
Indeed, and the Earl of Sandwich here is writing less than a generation after Winthrop. And since we're on the topic of Winthrop, do we want to turn to the dichotomy we all saw between John Smith and Winthrop?
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, let me just comment really quick, if I'm not roboting, on the forward-lookingness of the. Am I good?
Yes,
it's
we
raining
hear you.
really heavily. Okay, good.
All right. So, sorry, I thought I lost connection. So
No, you're good.
with Winthrop and Smith, we have two competing ideas.
Well, I think Charlie had a comment before we got there.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to read something really quickly in regard to the predictions that were just shared. This is page 1. Right? Massachusetts General Court in 1678, so only a few years after that quote, declared that the laws of England are bounded within the 4 seas and do not reach America, end quote. So it's quite early on, virtually 100 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed, that the colonies were already, particularly New England, was already looking at itself as something that governed itself independently and not by the laws of New England. It should also
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it should also be pointed out that one of the ways that the New England colonies would surpass England itself, going to page 272, I'll read, quote, by the early 18th century, Massachusetts was second only to London as a center of shipbuilding in the English-speaking world. So we're talking about 100 years from the prediction made in the 1600s that New England is now one of the shipbuilding capitals of the world. And there's further on in that later part of the book, it's made reference to how New England had a significant comparative advantage in terms of how much it costed to equip the ships with the necessary iron. So these, I believe, if I'm recalling correctly, that New England even surpassed the English capacity for shipbuilding by the time of the Revolutionary War. So,
and the selection of industries that they focused on is also instructive. Shipbuilding, rope making, tar, all the things you would need to conduct a mercantilist world policy are precisely the industries that New England focused on. All right, so the tale of our two Johns, John Winthrop and John Smith. Ryan, do you want to lay this out for us?
Yeah, sorry, I had a glitch where I could not hear Charlie. So, but yeah, so with John Smith and John Winthrop, we have two competing ideas, both of which you can see in what we now consider to be like classic Americana. So we have this, it's a blend of the two ideas. Neither one really wins out over the other such that we follow one and not the other. So with Winthrop, we have the more theologically minded idea that the colony was going to be theocratic. God ordains people to be on top, people to be below. He ordains people's wealth and people's poverty. And this was the way of things. It was the covenantal aspect is much more emphasized in Winthrop. Whereas with Smith, we have the ideal of social mobility. And I think this is somewhat stylized by the author, but nonetheless, the point still stands. With Smith, we have social mobility. New England is going to be a society in which anyone, no matter how poor, no matter his background, Smith, if I remember correctly, was a yeoman. So, so this society would allow those people to rise to the middle class, and then, so long as their merits were sufficient, also to the status of I don't think Smith used gentleman in particular, but sort of above even the middle class. Those are our two views. One's much more materialistic and sort of aspiring. The other one's much more theological, much more devout, if you will.
Yep, and then just to ground these two gentlemen historically a bit, Smith, famously associated with the Virginia colony, left Virginia after the disastrous failure of all the layabouts and wastrels there to feed themselves. And on sailing past New England, he didn't actually go to New England. He sailed past it, saw the land, and then immediately became a giant shill for colonizing New England. He wrote endless series of letters and tracts encouraging people to go and settle New England because it was a land that, as he said, called to men of great hearts and small means. For Smith, the entire point of colonizing New England would be to create a place where the lower classes of England could go to materially better themselves. It was a primarily materialist vision of economic improvement for the lower classes of England. If we want to pull up a screenshot, I think 24. At the heart of Smith's ethic, unlike Governor John Winthrop's, lay a vision of social mobility. Those who would enjoy the fruits of this society, the captain believed, would be England's hard-pressed people of small means. Indeed, for Smith, providing a haven for such men and women was very close to the whole point of New World colonization. Now, Winthrop, by contrast, as Ryan has already intimated, had a much more theological and metaphysical view of the point of colonizing New England. The point was not to provide an outlet for England's burgeoning industrial lower class, but rather to create a new Jerusalem, a shining city on the hill where the covenanted people of God would live out their lives in accordance with God's will.
Now, I think it's quite clear that Winthrop wins this, not even historically, but even at the time, because when such persons who John Smith wished to improve were brought over to the New World, it didn't really work out very well for the existing colonies anytime that happened.
Yeah, as we saw in Virginia, they had a tremendous problem with an indigent underclass that the Anglican Church had to spend 80% of its revenues feeding.
Right, and the other interesting thing is that Smith gets his vision in the state of Georgia, which is, at the time it was created, was renowned for being backwards. Not necessarily because it was new, people wouldn't be that quick to judge, but just because of the types of people that settled Georgia, since it was established specifically and only for like the poor English. It was a very rowdy society. It was somewhat amoral. So this is that's not the New England ideal that we ended up with.
Indeed, and it's not really. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mentioned as well when we discussed Albion's Seed that the Puritan colonies basically, one of the reasons they were migrating away from England was to avoid this high-low versus middle mechanism. that comes from having these underclass brought in and serving wealthier people in the society or aristocrats. This ties in actually to what many of us have been reading over the past few years. For example, Bertrand de Juvenel, I believe, is where high, low versus middle originated as a specifically outlined theory. The thing to remember about these concepts of power, whether or not you call them elite theory or however you want to categorize the Juvenel, that these aren't inexorable iron laws of the universe. The Puritans basically found a way for a time, for at least 100 years, I would say, to virtually eliminate the high-low versus middle mechanism as something that could even be implemented. So there are ways. It's important to regard the Puritan colony as an example of how to do that, basically how you can prevent the lower class from being used against you by an upper class, and you actually can sort of break what some might consider an iron law and prevent these things from existing at all. In some ways,
Indeed.
the Puritans are really the ultimate representation of the ideal many people have of America, where there are no kings and there's no slaves. There's only people of high agency and with a high ability to succeed in whatever line of work they're into. That is the foundation of the Puritan colony and why it was really the most successful colony.
And it's what
And
we have to. Go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing as well is that Smith's vision didn't really die. And even though at the time it was implemented very poorly, there are elements which you see in America before any major terrible events have happened. So in the early 19th century, which is a fairly uncontested period of time, most people think that all the terribly bad events happened sometime after the early 19th century. You do see this John Smith's ideal invoked quite often, that even the poor in America can develop themselves into landholders somewhere, usually the frontier, which we'll talk about later. But it's an ideal that's persisted quite often.
Oh, absolutely. Smith's idea didn't die. It became central to the American ethos. As someone, I forget who, famously said, every American feels himself to be a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. This idea of going from rags to riches is about as an American a story as you can tell. But let us not paint Smith as being overly materialistic. If we could pull up screenshot 33, please. So for those who don't remember the story of the original Jamestown colony and how things went early on in Virginia, they brought in a lot of nobles and a lot of people who weren't used to working very hard. And so none of them did, and the colony almost starved. And the lessons of that experiment were twofold for Smith. The search for short-term profit leads to failure. The link between productive labor and land ownership must be recognized. The desire to provide oneself and one's family with a comfortable level of subsistence Smith regarded as natural and even commendable, so long as acquisitive instincts were tempered by ethical scruples and respect for the public good, and not the coercive hand of state regulation, but the normative values inculcated by families, churches, and schools were to be the principal means for achieving this end. Which the second half of that quote is, of course, a refrain we often hear in libertarian circles, that not state action, but normative societal values are the way to impose social standards. And that's still very much with us today.
And if you keep in mind the Massachusetts government, this wasn't really under dispute either, because I don't think Winthrop had a secular state in mind. It was very much the church and the moral character of the colony that would regulate it into as more stratified. That's not really the word.
Yeah, it's important not to position Smith and Winthrop as being diametrically opposed. They had different visions for the colonies, but those visions did overlap in quite a few spheres.
Right, and then it's also worth mentioning as well that it's not the libertarians talk about it most today, but throughout, once again, most of American history, this was the idea: families, churches, schools, the locality, the community would be responsible for making sure that everyone was socially well regulated. This was a Puritan ideal, and it's one that I quite like, at the very least.
And we talked about Smith's view of the failure of the Virginia experiment. Now let's look at Winthrop. If we could pull up screenshot 34, please. To Winthrop, Virginia represented the inevitable fate of an uncovenanted people governed by the sinfulness of natural liberty, a term that we will remember from 3 weeks ago, and driven by almost entirely by worldly motives. And so this comes down to it, at least in Winthrop's view. The Smith vision is driven almost entirely by worldly motives. Its lack of a theological or metaphysical grounding dooms it from the start, and this is what he sets out to avoid in New England.
Yeah, I don't really want to comment on whether Virginia was doomed or whatnot, because
well, it wasn't doomed, obviously.
Right. Well,
Smith's view, or Winthrop's view, looking at it in 1640 or so. But
well, I mean, even in moral terms, like I'm sure there are different groups could make different arguments regarding that. But it is perhaps worth tying this back into what we learned about the southern colonies in Albion's seed. They did struggle a lot more with these things. Something we've been trying to inculcate into the audience is this idea that you should not despise any of these groups if you are American, since they developed America. They are the constituencies of America. But that's not to say that they don't have their pros and cons. Certainly in New England, if anyone in our sphere, and I think we all do, wants to see a less degenerated society, or perhaps how you even might come out of one that was more degenerated and sort of try to remedy that, the Puritans are really the ones to look to. Which
yes,
goes
like
against
for example, there's this meme among people in our sphere that the Virginian elite are the real sort of founders of America. The Declaration of Independence was majorly signed by Virginian elites, but the American Revolution was really a product of Virginia elites combined with Puritan industry. Without both of those things working together, and obviously the other groups are represented too, but without both of those two elements working in tandem, there could not possibly have been a whole United States of America that emerged victorious in a war against England.
The revolution was not sparked by the Richmond massacre. It was sparked by the Boston massacre. So both physically and intellectually, the Puritans' contribution to American nationhood is absolutely essential.
And of course, America as a nation really developed first in New England. For example, the New Englanders were the first to print paper money, and fairly
first
early
to
on,
set up a representative government.
Yeah, in fact, they were quite fearful of being ruled by executive prerogative. So this idea of a self-representative government that was entirely detached from England originated far earlier in New England than it did really in any of the other major colonies in the continent.
And just to explore this Cavalier Puritan dichotomy a little more, can we bring up screenshot 36? Ascetic Puritanism, in perhaps its greatest contrast to the Renaissance ideal of the leisured gentleman, imposed its work ethic on highborn and lowborn alike. Winthrop, as did Smith during his leadership of Virginia, made a conspicuous example of his own willingness to perform manual labor. And we touched on that when we talked about the Puritans and Albion's seed. But even though New England did have a flattened class system of gentlemen and freeholders, no one was immune from this requirement to work.
Yeah, I'll read, for example, here, page 202. The Bay colonists' constitutionalism reflected the anti-authoritarianism and egalitarianism latent in the Puritan mission, or indeed in Reformed Protestantism itself. Protestantism, especially in its Calvinist manifestations, undercut the traditional conception of religion as propitiation. it's a difficult word. Propitiation, by building its entire doctrine on the distinction between the states of grace and reprobation. Ascetic Puritanism subverted existing notions of social hierarchy. According to its dictates, the status of the equality of individuals rested ultimately on their individual responsibility to God. Obviously, that ties in directly to what you just said.
And to reinforce your point, if we want to pull up screenshot 35, Winthrop's assertions that men and women needed to be gifted for such a work and that no bond of conscience could be imposed upon the unregenerate suggest the predestinarian interpretation of the work ethic. So this is more specific than Protestant. It really is a very Calvinist phenomenon we're examining here.
And something else, just on the general point of leisure and work, is that there's a very strange idea that to have a truly right-wing society, you have to have a leisure class that basically does not work. It's just there to be aristocratic and rule and look cool, I suppose. But I don't think anyone would say that Puritan society was left-wing. If you look at all this, and they specifically tried to exclude that class of people, as we've been mentioning throughout the stream.
Ryan, they were peasants of the soul. Come on.
Right,
well,
right.
This really demonstrates the sort of uselessness in trying to retroactively apply the left-right distinction between all historical groups. I mean, it can apply in some places, but it's like, were the Puritans left-wing or right-wing? It's like the question doesn't really make any sense. They were Republicans, they were constitutionalists, they opposed executive authority or executive prerogative that was arbitrary, but does that make them left-wing? Like, as opposed to what? That doesn't make any sense. There is no other side to compare them to. They were running very much their own distinct society. It was a very highly religious society, highly moral society. Like, in what way can you look at this and be like, oh, it's left wing? It doesn't make any sense. Because there's no wings, right? There's nothing to compare it to.
I agree.
The seating arrangements in the Estate General had not even been set up at this point.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically my point. It's like that the act of having a Republican form of government can't possibly be left-wing in of itself, which is really the only element you can really look towards here. And again, like, not having aristocrats or something doesn't make a society not right-wing. But, like I'm saying, that the whole paradigm doesn't make any sense when one tries to apply it to the Puritans.
Right, and then even in Puritan society, there were people that, when most of us think of aristocrats, there were those in New England. It's just they didn't have these ideals of leisure and relaxation and whatnot else. They were still the aristocracy, whether in the earlier days the people of highest piety and learnedness, or in later days less so. But they still worked, which, reading some of our esoteric Southern European literature would seem to disqualify them from an aristocracy, but yet our own American history shows that they existed, and that was how they were treated.
There's other things I could read here on the Puritans and their particular republicanism, if you like. This might get us toward another thing we need to discuss. I'll read here on page 200. Quote, in declaring that obedience to God meant resistance to tyrants, the saints in England and America obtained a powerful rationale for repudiating the ancien regime. The saints' resistance to a tyrannical government was explicitly justified by such older doctrines, such as Salus Populi Suprema Lex, favored by Roman law, and the newer imperatives brought by covenant theology. The overthrow of Governor-General Sir Edmund Andros in 1689, in what proved to be a dress rehearsal for 1776, was justified on the grounds that the Dominion government had abridged the New Englanders' long-established rights to representation. When The 1629 charter was revoked by a writ of Skyr Facias in 1684. All land titles granted under the charter were called into question. In petitioning the crown following the quo warranto proceedings of the Committee on Trade and Plantations in June 1683 against the Massachusetts Charter, the colonists embraced what was soon to emerge as the Lockean labor theory of property. Title to land, and hence right to representation, belongs to those whose labors subdue and improve it. End quote.
Indeed, and there's another part in the book, I don't remember the page number exactly, but we see that when King Charles granted a charter to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he put in the proviso that it would be subject to the laws of England. And within 20 years, basically, of getting there, the Puritans abrogated that, set up the general court, and began to make their own laws.
On the subject of homesteading, basically, is what was being described in the book there. This is an idea that's core to America. And I'll get to this in a moment, but it's not even necessarily economic that one must improve the land in order to own it. The Puritans viewed this as a moral necessity because you have to remember they had found Zion on the shores that they landed. This was going to be their pious and moral enclave, isolated from the world, where they could follow God. They had to develop the land because they had to work. That was their worship, and developing the land was one of the many signs of doing so. So it's not even necessarily just economic. It's a moral thing to improve the land.
Yeah, this idea of mixing your labor with the land is central to the American conception of ownership even today. In America, we have what may seem a very strange doctrine called adverse possession, where if you move onto someone else's land and stay there for 20 years and they don't expel you, that's your land now. And the idea behind that is claim to land proceeds from using the land, improving the land, working the land. And if you can't be bothered after 20 years to expel someone who's set up squatting on your land, then that's their land now.
All right, Zoomers, you heard it. This is how you get a house.
Just got to stay there for 20 years.
Yeah. If I remember correctly as well, I think the Homestead Act, this monumental piece of legislation that formed American culture, I believe one of the requirements was that you had to have developed the land that you were claiming. I think that was one of the 3 or 4.
5 years to hit such and such a metric, I think, to keep it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is this gets used economically, and I don't think that's wrong, especially if you're an economist. But there is the moral element that has been lost here, especially in applying it. Yeah, because once again, we're talking a lot about economics. That's what the book is nominally based around, is the Puritan economy. But the Puritans didn't really view themselves all too economically until much later. It was just a consequence.
Now, one of the reasons I wanted to read that particular quote there is because it mentioned repudiating the ancien regime. And one particular aspect that was repudiated was the guild system. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to comment on that, any being the economic experts here or whatnot, but it's important to note that the Puritans specifically included this ancient structure which established monopolies over fields of trade, and of course the guilds were backed by the crown. Basically, there were no guilds in the New England colony. There were not limitations on who could engage in labor. There were no limitations as such a guild would have, where you have to apprentice for 5 years in this line of work, ironsmithing, whatever, before it was legal for you to engage in that work. It was legal for anyone to engage in any lawful form of work and business that they were capable of doing.
So I was trying to limit any sort of economic analysis from me because I feel like that's better suited to a different platform.
Well, I don't necessarily want to do that. I just wanted to note its significance in terms of how they were able to utilize the resources they had available.
Right, but I will say there are elements where economics and social policy meet, and this would be one of them, because a lot of, once again, more traditionalist types will expound upon the virtues of the guild system, and there were many, especially in modern society today, where there are no real hierarchies based upon anything that's good. If you look back at the guild system and you see that there is a codified method of progression up the ladder that's based off of virtues like work and competence, then that looks appealing. But one of the consequences of the guild system, of course, is that because it has that codified level of progression, there is going to be a large underclass resulting from it, just in terms of time friction. So like if it takes me decades in order to own my own workshop to produce things according to my wishes, there's going to be a lot of people waiting for that to happen. They're going to be in the lower class. So it goes against the Puritan system, but I would also say that it's a good thing that America did not really inherit a guild system, because if you had one and you had such a culture, we would have an underclass, not just in the South where it was imported, but you'd also have one in the North as well, way before it got here by means of immigration and importation from corporations to settle the frontier, work in factories or whatnot else. We at least had, I don't know, half century or so of our own social development, such that we could at least impart it somewhat to today. We would have had way less had the guilds persisted, I would say. That's my opinion. And at least that's I think, part of the justification for the Puritans.
Another aspect that we haven't really touched on, there was a screenshot in the collection about trade, but basically the Puritan colony underwent a number of economic crises periods, but they were able to sustain themselves because they were so highly integrated with what was called at the time the West Indies. Of course, this is the islands in the Caribbean, and also England itself. So this is really why the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Puritans were able to weather all the crises that afflicted them throughout the century.
Indeed, if you want to pull it up, screenshot number 6. And this just kind of touches on the export-based economy that the Puritans were running from very early on. It is noted that the island's inhabitants, and the island being referred to here is Madeira, which is the source of some of the best wine in the world, chiefly consume the products of New England, the shipping of which country furnishes them with French wine and brandy and Madeira wines in exchange for their fish, without depending for any supply from England. So you see, you've got a sprawling trade network here developing for an export-led economy.
Let me just comment on that a little further. So this is on towards the end of the book when sawmills are being discussed. And it reads, quote, "A surprisingly high proportion of the sugar mills, slave cabins, and warehouses on Barbados, the Leeward Islands, and Jamaica were fashioned from New England lumber." So that's fascinating, because you imagine how far those islands are from New England, and the comparative advantage for the New England colony is such that it's more efficient to import finished milled lumber all the way from New England down in the Caribbean. I mean, that really demonstrates the power of the trade networks they developed.
I don't really have much more to add on the subject.
Very disappointing.
Yes, I had something marked down on page okay, this was interesting. Page 303, this is just to kind of compare the speed at which New England developed. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up the lack of the guild system, because what the guild system would have fundamentally done is slow down the development of New England's economy. So on page 303 here, quote, "Plymouth colony waited 13 years to establish its first grist mill and 36 years to build its first sawmill. Massachusetts had built functioning versions of both within 4 years of landfall." End quote.
And then to emphasize the rapidness of development, if we pull up screenshot number 8, This is not just industrial development, but human development we're looking at. Although only about 5% of the settlers who crossed the Atlantic before 1700 came to New England during the Great Migration, by that year, meaning 1700, their descendants totaled more than 40% of the Old World population in the American colonies, not counting those who migrated to New York and East New Jersey, because New York and East New Jersey don't count.
Well, this is a very important point to make here, which is you're in a. Actually, no. I'll make a different point first. Once again, since all economic concerns to the Puritans flow from moral concerns, if you try to stifle the development that is preventing the increase of their society just by being able to sustain as much people. And this is a sort of idea that has to be grappled with. I think a lot of people in our sphere have gotten very comfortable with the idea that we can sort of just revert back to some very distant part of the past in terms of development. But all that's going to do is it might raise, say, birth rates nominally from what they are now. But it's going to prevent any sort of real reaction or any sort of a comeback, because this is all a moral concern. It'd be a very strange materialist position to just lay all of our ills at the hands of material. The other thing is that there's the international element to this. So as Charlie has been talking about a lot through this, it's New England's industrial and population development that allowed America to achieve independence to begin with. Not even just the political and social contributions from them. This rapid development is what allowed that. So this is something to grapple with for a lot of people in our spheres. I think this development.
Yes, I think the statistic, I lost the reference in the book. I was just looking at it. Something like 40%. It might have been one of the screenshots. 40% of the population of New England was second generation by. I can't remember what the year was. I was just looking at this a few minutes ago. Let me scroll through the screenshots real quick.
Yeah, sure. But the point is that the Puritan society.
Yeah, here it is.
Go ahead.
Okay, so quote, although only about 5% of the settlers who crossed the Atlantic before 1700 came to New England during the Great Migration, by that year, their descendants totaled more than 40% of the Old World population in American colonies, not counting those who had migrated to New York and East Jersey.
And just to reemphasize, that's because New York and East Jersey don't count.
So that's worded a little strangely. So in 1700, the descendants of the 5% of settlers who crossed before 1700 totaled more than 40% of the Old World population.
Wait. You're telling me 5% of the population did 40% of the breeding?
Yeah, that's. I don't think the math works out exactly that way, but yeah, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a tremendous rate of natural increase.
So if you remember the American language last week, at least for Charlie, this is something that Mencken points out, was that New England, whenever we reached the eve of independence, had over 1 million men in it, or a million people. But most of that came from a small group of families, which I'm glad we can reemphasize the point here, because it kind of shows that this is your future society, the population. You can come back with very little, and it's not predetermined. This is a matter of will, spirituality, and all these other things, which the Puritans demonstrate. England did not have this same trajectory of development, for instance.
I want to comment on something else that's essential to the success of the Puritan economy, which is the manner in which the public was able to invest in these major works. This is particularly relevant to shipbuilding. In order to fund and reduce the risk of shipbuilding you would have joint stock investments by multiple parties, say 8 different people investing in a ship rather than the single one. And so to a large extent, the persons within the colony who had money to invest contributed it jointly towards the major works projects. I'll read really quickly here on page 304, quote, "The construction of a Salem sawmill on joint partnership principles highlights many of the distinctive features of the Bay Colony's economic culture: linkage, innovative financing, contractualism, and the wide diffusion of capital investment. Since each New England sawmill cost as much as £750 to build, the need to spread both capital and risk was apparent." End quote. And there's a little quote about some investments at the time, but I think the point is made. And obviously, this is healthy for the society in general. I would say for the elites to be jointly invested in the elements of the economy that would improve the time, to use the Puritan concept.
Indeed. And then just by way of perspective, I think I remember in Albion Seed we read that £20 was a middle class wage earner's income in 1 year. So £750 would have been a catastrophically large sum that had to be diffusely subscribed.
Yeah, and this is something that we are currently missing. If only we had any sort of conviction like that, or even elites of our own people above us with those beliefs. But alas, something perhaps that we can fix in a few generations' time.
Really quick, towards the very end of the last chapter, I'll just comment by reading this quote. Quote, "Much of what was distinctive about the Bay Colony's civic ecology derives from the nature of the New England township. The town was among the more intentionally innovative structures created by the Massachusetts settlers. It combined elements of the English borough, parish, and feudal manor. Virtually all New England men and women, whether land proprietors or not, possessed a stake in their local government and conducted their economic affairs and political deliberations accordingly. The towns, moreover, had the resources, particularly with respect to land, to stimulate economic development. In England, the basic unit of local government, the ecclesiastical parish, typically averaged about 5 square miles. New England towns, such as Dedham, during the 17th century, on the other hand, could include as many as 200 square miles." End quote. So this was something commented on in Albion Seed as well, but it might seem strange to regard the town as a novel concept, but in fact the towns set up by the New England colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were not only innovative in their size, their layout, but also the social investitures that the persons within the town were given within the local government and land distribution and all of that. So this is a really important factor of social technology, we can say, that the Puritans developed that really contributed to their success, contra where England itself was at the time. So I think we're probably approaching the end here. This will target our shorter 90-minute runtime, unless you two have anything to add. I thought I might read a little bit just from the conclusion. Is there anything else that we ought to address before we start wrapping up?
I think that Mr. Quinn had a couple of points about. I believe he said that we got like some of the worst elements of both sides of Winthrop and Smith's vision as New England society progressed, but I might be misremembering.
No, I'm good. Thank you. I think we've covered everything
right.
I had to say on the subject.
Okay.
By all means, conclude us.
Well, before we do conclude, I will say something that's interesting, is that very briefly, New England society did look very distributist. It was a society of smallholders and small producers. Everyone was aligned in the community. I do find that interesting.
Indeed, when the era of autarkic municipal nuclear reactors comes, it will come to New England.
Yes. Okay, well, let me just read a bit from the conclusion, because I think it gives an overview pretty nicely. So, quote, Massachusetts succeeded by freeing its economy of anachronistic restraints and by recognizing the link between land ownership and productive labor. Labor, a painful necessity in the Old World, became a source of increased productivity in this portion of the New. In contrast to the patrimonial mercantilism that prevailed in early Virginia, Bermuda, and in the Puritan experiment on Providence Island, where tenancy, not freehold tenure, had prevailed, the Bay colonists recognized that successful New World colonization would necessitate a shift from paternalism to reciprocal obligations. Instead of deferring to the will of kings, nobles, and prelates, local initiative and responsibility were to be the hallmarks of the covenant based society of the Bay Colony. To a striking degree, by early modern standards, social, political, and religious networks were organized horizontally, not hierarchically. New England's communally based individualism, grounded in the concept of the grace bearing individual, produced the fundamental basis of civil society. New England also succeeded because its leaders and people used their newfound autonomy and freedom to pursue honest gain instead of present profit. The Protestant ethic and the culture of discipline fostered an ethos of production with high value given to work, enterprise, sacrifice, and deferred gratification. Capitalism in the early modern period, no less than the present, required countervailing institutions if its destructive capacities were to be kept in check. It required a measure of local control over economic policy and resources, what is now called devolution of control. It demanded civic protection against what Puritans decried as cruelty and unmercifulness to the poor. It required not only the preservation of individual rights, contracts, and due process of law, but also a vibrant civil society capable of promoting social justice and mutual responsibility in the face of capitalism's tendency to undermine both. More important for our own purposes was the fact that civil society fostered the creation of social capital, networks, norms, and the trust that facilitates mutual cooperation. End quote.
Mm.
So yeah, I don't want to belabor reading the book too much. The conclusion's pretty good, but anything you two want to add on top of that before we read super chat and close the stream out?
Just to bang the drum again, that our task with this series is one, to identify the virtues of our forefathers, two, to examine where those virtues were winnowed away by the onward march of modernity, and three, determine how to thread the needle, how to get back those virtues without falling prey to the same vices.
Let me, on that note, let me actually read this Alexis de Tocqueville quote in the conclusion. Quote, selfishness blights the germ of all virtue. Individualism at first only saps the virtues of public life, but in the long run it attacks and destroys all others, and is at length absorbed in downright selfishness. Selfishness is a vice as old as the world, which does not belong to one form of society more than another, but individualism is of democratic origin and threatens to spread in the same ratio as the equality of condition. End quote.
And that is the prophetic story of your atomization.
Indeed. All right, so I will read our super chat from Solid Snake 1964 for $3. He is first and only, in fact. Evening, gents. Have to watch later. Keep up the good content. Saying hello from a vacation in Minnesota. That's an odd place to go on vacation, but I hope you enjoy yourself. Okay, so Ryan, Mr. Quinn, thank you for joining us for this discussion. I think this has been a good discussion. And oh yes, we need to again recommend the next several books we're going to be reading. So, as is tradition at the end of each stream, our next Monday we're going to be looking at The Flowering of New England by Van Wyck Brooks. This one actually has the Christopher Sandbach approval, so take that with what you will. And the next week after that, we'll be reading Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier in American History.
That's right, folks. We will not stay on New England forever.
Yeah, it does seem like we focused a lot on New England, but I think it's important because there needs to be some work done in rehabilitating our own heritage in regard to that part of the country. And then The third book we have coming up, I think we resolved to do Common Sense. Are we? We'll have to finalize that, I suppose. But that may be what we do following this book on the frontier.
Yeah, that was my understanding. And I think we might be the first people in our sphere to actually go through it instead of just making general claims about it.
It is, after all, the most equitably distributed of all man's gifts.
Okay, it's affirmed. Common Sense coming up in 3 weeks.